Hey, it's Jason here again, and today we're talking with Breyden Taylor. He's a guy that I've previously introduced as someone who could probably build ChatGPT from scratch and rewrite GoHighLevel's entire workflow engine and casually code a landing sequence for Starship on Mars before lunch. So I don't know if that was a little too much or not, but here's the man anyway. He has been an awesome, well, throughout the last months, we've been back and forth. A great guy, very much of an engineering mind, and he's got incredible knowledge regarding AI and from when it started to where it's going. We're looking to dive into that as well as get some of his prompting knowledge. So I'm super excited to dive into this. Brayden, I want to hear more about who you are. If
Yep,
you don't
for
mind
sure.
introducing
Thank you for
yourself
that
a little bit.
introduction, for the kind, I will say, exaggerated compliments. Have not yet been on a
Oh, is
starship, but hopefully
it?
someday AI can do that for me. No, I'm very happy to be here talking with you.
There we go.
Let's see. I guess we can just jump right into background. Background wise, I'm kind of a mutt, so definitely have like a formal education in strategic communication, which has played a big role in how I interact with AI. But as far as engineering is concerned, I'm self-taught over a long period of time. So started with POS systems way back in 28, 2010, I want to say, and started to see how tech could impact small business and businesses in general. So ended up helping on launch teams for a couple different restaurants and running operations for those, and kind of like fell in love with the idea that technology and culture had like a role to play with one another, and there were positive impacts there if implemented correctly. So then did some consulting, and I went back to school. That was where I got strategic communication, kind of a little bit more hammered out detail wise. And now I just like to pull everything together. I think 3 years ago was when I started getting really hands on with coding. And so from an actual coding perspective, coming from that systems architecture background with POS systems, Python was my go-to as of 3 years ago, and now kind of whatever is needed. Python is still my strongest, but there's still some different languages that I've been playing around with recently. So
That's cool. And so, how has that all tied into your AI? Honestly, before we dive into that, so your strategic communications training, is that why you call me Senior Flappy Chops?
exactly, you know,
Uh,
every single interaction you have with somebody, right? You got to be planning those out.
No, I've never come across anybody who's so creative in their responses. It's absolutely it's amusing and highly entertaining and obviously
I
communicate
think
really
that's
well as well.
weirdo
Um,
aspect of it
aside
too,
from
to
just
be honest.
entertainment, so.
Very standard individual. But yeah, the strategic communication thing actually has been a challenge from a personal growth layer, because I thought I was good at it, and then when I started really diving into AI about two-ish, 2.5 years ago, I had the hardest time explaining it to people, and what it could do, and narrowing the scope or applying the scope well. So it was funny because I was a science communication professor at Purdue and could not explain this scientific phenomenon to save my life. So I've been working on that ever since, and we're getting there, but still working.
So do you have kind of a
No,
one-liner
no.
now that explains it?
It depends on who you are, right? What you
Yeah,
want to hear about. Yeah.
right. Yeah, 100%, 100%. Now, as far as just kind of your hobbies and stuff like that, so later on we want to dive into Assistable and how we see that, where we see that going, or where he sees that going, and the potential for agencies and the prompting, kind of some tips and tricks on that because Braden's a master at that. But I'm just curious. So I saw something about you refinishing an RV, I think. Is that something that,
My
is there
sister
nothing of
actually
that
was
nature?
working on a van. I think we did talk about that. Yeah, we did. It had to have been about 6 months ago. Um, Unfortunately, that's not a hobby of mine
Yeah.
yet. We did stay in an RV for a weekend, and it could be the great thing about Assistable and anything in the AI space is if you have Wi-Fi, you can work. So
Can work from
I
anywhere.
do
Oh,
love
100%.
camping.
Yeah, I
So
love that about it. I love it about it. Okay. I was just okay. I was curious if you had some like odd, well, it's not odd, but odd hobby where you like fully into AI, and then on the side you also redo
Yeah,
RVs,
definitely
or at
camping
least redid
up
your
there
own and
with
stuff like
hobby
that. Because
wise.
that'd be
But
interesting.
at this point, and probably for the last 2 years or so, my hobby has been AI, alongside it being my obsession. So where we're
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's awesome. That's really fantastic. Um, and so now diving back into kind of your AI exposure, and then with Assistable, I know you've worked with Assistable on the back end at times, when it was really needed and stuff like that. Do you mind just diving into a little bit more about your AI exposure and how you got into that? And you're now obviously seen as a major
Yeah, for
opportunity. So
sure.
I'm curious
So it kind of
on
started
that.
with just research and exploration, and to some extent that still continues. I consider research and development still an aspect of my business. Although now that I'm full time AI, I have noticed there's a slight priority shift away from research and more into the applicability side, right? That I've witnessed in all of you agency owners, for the past couple years. It's suddenly very real to me. So that's interesting. So that's been fun to interact, kind of juggling the research and exploration and curiosity aspects with straight up value adds and deliverables and functional AI, right? So at some point along the way, I met one of my friends who's in St. Louis. He introduced me to GoHighLevel, and I was poking around the developer marketplace and found Assistable, and that was, I think, I signed up. And back in those days, it just pulled you right into the workspace, and I started playing around. And I think I talked to Haley several times. I'm pretty sure I talked to Jordan once. I'm not sure if it was him or an AI at that time. I still don't know. We joke about that. But yeah, then Jordan and I had a really long meeting, and just talked about AI in general and kind of where we see it going for society. And there's a lot of kindred alignment there. So I was excited to find such a applicable and functional AI platform, already built by somebody who thinks of AI in the same way that I do.
Mhm. And from there, it's kind of developing to the point now where you're working more in Assistable. Part of your business is it is in Assistable now. And so, on that note, I'm curious what you're seeing as far as agencies deploying AI voice, AI chat. You're kind of talking about, us potentially seeing the biggest wave of people coming into not just Assistable, but overall into AI, applicable AI beforehand. Do you
Yeah,
mind
for
kind of
sure.
alluding to
So
that
I
and talking
think
about that a
that
little bit?
the digital marketing space in general, which is a space that was relatively new to me and actually had a learning curve bigger than the AI learning curve on my end, which has been contrary to a lot of the people in the group, I think. But it's at a very interesting intersection to me because you have small business, you have agency owners, and you have actual AI providers upstream, right? And so to me, agency owners are right at that intersection where early adopters kind of met. And so that convergence point has created this weird collaborative and domainless like energy where everybody who was in the group had a curiosity aspect because they're an early adopter, and there were some traits like that that were across the board the same. And sometimes niches overlapped, or niches or niches overlapped. But all in all, it's just a bunch of people who are really excited about what AI can do. And so I think we've moved through a lot of those early adopter stages, and now 2025, obviously, AI is shifting mainstream to some extent. And that's where you have people who are not necessarily as excited about AI itself, and maybe people who are excited about what AI can do, right? And so that takes a little bit of a shift. And I think that's what we're seeing successful agency owners in the assistable community doing right now is communicating effectively what AI can do, and being okay with not trying to explain what AI is, and what it, what it can do for their target clientele. And they've got those messages kind of hammered out. So I think that's going to be really, really important because as it goes mainstream, it's just going to be a flood. Um, yeah,
An absolute flood. But also, it's fascinating if you look at the applications for it currently. Now, there's so much that can be done, but we see a couple of the major ones coming out, which is obviously lead follow up or inbound calling. Taking those calls, appointment setting, and all that. Um, but there's obviously so much that's untapped at this point. Where do you see this going? Like, first of all, maybe consider Assistable specifically, but then even AI in general for a local business owner, for an agency
Sure.
owner, and
Um,
applying that.
I don't know about you. I think Assistable, like really early establishment of a foothold in a really intelligence uh, sort of foundational way for this like external and internal kind of interaction. So, like lead follow up, for instance, that's something where there's an outbound communication going. And the sales pipeline was just like perfect for early AI testing, right? Because at the end of the day, we're having a hard time even pricing AI, right? Because how do you price something that has, in a sense, limitless value, right? It's you price it based on either alternatives or the value add sort of model. Very difficult to do, and so by choosing the digital marketing arena and especially the sales pipeline, Jordan essentially set up just like these three different areas of that pipeline that voice was going to be really big in and already is, right? So where does it go from there? I think it's shifting a little bit more internal. And so you'll see people in the community talking about, okay, so we've got an AI that's handling our leads and conversions and enrichment and retention and things like that. But like, how do we have an AI that manages our CRM? Or how do we have an AI that manages my email inbox? Or how do we have an AI that manages the AIs that manage my CRM and my email inbox, right? And so that's kind of, I think, where it's for me, where it's headed is more of that comprehensive scope across a small business where it's not just a function like sales pipeline. It's actually baked into a bunch of different functions across the entrepreneur or business owners scope.
That's really fascinating, and obviously there's a lot of different applications for that. Um, when it comes to, but let's just keep an eye, think about the outward focus for a little bit longer. When it comes to connecting Assistable to outside tools to do more complicated things, like there's obviously limitless potential there as well. Like it's not just limited to speed to lead. It's not just limited to inbound calling, but you can do potentially, well, this is a fairly
Mhm.
easy one, support, for example, right? And in a case like that, you might need to connect to outside systems. What have you seen? Like, I know you're an expert in build ship, like N8N, all that. Like, you understand that. What different applications can you see come into play with Assistable, considering the outside
Interesting.
tools?
I think inventory management is like around the corner. That one seems to make sense for me. Things in which the knowledge base is kind of more dynamic as opposed to informational. So with like a speed to lead, you want the AI to have a basic understanding of what your business does and what it can do for your ICP. Um, so like the next phase of that is how do you provide information that changes over time to an AI in a way that it can retrieve it live during a conversation, right? Or in a way, to your point, connecting with other systems in a way that it can leverage workflows to do actual longer processes outside of the conversational space that might support the conversational space, but aren't necessarily just conversation driven, right?
Yep. Yep. Yeah, it's really fascinating having seen a couple of those things show up, like with solar, for example, right? Being able to literally track, what's the sun angle and how many solar panels will you need, all those different pieces, right? Or with the search, and this is honestly a new development with Assistable, but the search the web. Search for Zillow and check and see what size the lot is or something like that. Like, in real estate, things like that could come into play. It's just fascinating that the limitless capabilities, right? And so I think as an agency owner, many times it is important kind of as you were alluding to, that maybe less research,
Right.
more on the applicable side, right? I think as agency owners, we do get sidetracked easily by all these new features, and so I love hearing about it. At the same time, I always recommend stay focused. Stay focused, because if you don't stay focused on something that actually brings in
Yeah,
revenue, you're
absolutely.
probably not going to make it. So, or at least it's not going to benefit you in the
Sure, sure.
financial way
Yeah,
that
and
you'd want it to.
if you look at it
Um,
kind of as
so
a roadmap, and maybe you always want to have that curiosity and chase the shiny object thing is just a part of who you are. I think one thing that I'm trying to do is hammer down the reoccurring revenue to free up that creative spirit side of things, right? So, as opposed to doing that the other way around and trying to, make the research make money somehow, or the development or the more fun stuff make money. Um, it turns out that you can just do the
mhm.
functional stuff first, and it actually shapes your research in a really interesting way. And that hands-on application stuff isn't something that theory, or no matter how much you're reading, can replicate. It's absolutely unique, and the fastest way to learn as well.
Yeah. Good point. Very good point. Um, so when it comes to, and now diving into a little bit more of prompting, because obviously if you're an agency owner deploying AI, you or somebody on your team is working in prompting. What are some things that you have noticed? So that obviously in Assistable, we're quite heavily task based, but I know Jordan just mentioned something about protocol based, and I'm curious on your perspective and some kind of nuances, some things, some tips, tricks, and whatever that
Yeah, for sure.
could benefit the agency owner.
And that's the interesting part. It's always changing. Protocol based, for instance, and
Yeah.
goal oriented or objective oriented. There's different systems that can work really well. In my experience, the goal task framework that has been an Assistable for a long time is a very natural approach, and works very well. I think one of the things that I have to tell myself is that every time we communicate, we make assumptions and we use shortcuts, right? So when Jason and I interact, there's multiple channels in which we're receiving and sending information, right? Verbal, nonverbal, but also contextual awareness of like societal norms and things that are acceptable and aren't. Like we joked about what we were dressing up for this podcast, right? And you can't not wear clothes, right? That's like a societal thing. And AI
Yeah.
understands that because of the fact that most texts in a professional setting have rules, right? But ultimately, at its core, AI doesn't have an understanding of norms outside of what it's trained on. And so, when you're prompting, I think what I do is tend to either over dictate norms, or assume that the AI knows something that it doesn't and has no way of knowing. And so I think from a practical perspective, the solid approach is to have like a structure that you always use, be it the task-based framework that is defaults and assistable, or something that spins off of that, and just keep that structure relatively standard across the board. We'll talk about dynamic custom fields here in a bit, I would imagine, but that structure helps me stay organized with the way that I'm communicating to the AI, to make sure it has all the context it needs, without making assumptions.
Right. And this is something I noticed in like Sesame AI, which is kind of a big deal now in some places, I guess. Um, I noticed that the context was really, really good. Like it understood things and it referred to them. Now, to replicate that in a typical conversation, like Assistable is very specifically made to talk with leads, to talk with via phone calls and stuff like that. Typically, you might not share quite as much of that type of context in the conversations as what they were doing. But I'm curious, what do you see on that? The difference between that, and is there a way to potentially bring a little bit
Yeah,
more of that into
I call
Assistable?
that. I mean, one of the frameworks for that is something I'm kind of referring to as like a narrative or a biographical approach to prompting. So if you think about, you know, if you were to try to tell your AI all the things that it should or shouldn't do, when interacting with a lead, the list would be 1,000 miles long and it would never be exhaustive, right? There's always edge cases that pop up. Um,
Yep.
so it's kind of a fool's errand. Sometimes it's worth it to put implicit or explicit directions for specific things, like response guidelines, for instance, with a voice AI, telling it to interact with certain formats in a specific way so it sounds more natural. Um, but others, it's much easier to approach with a situational sort of assignment. So if if you want, your AI to follow these sets of rules, think of a three adjectives that describe a person who does follow those rules, right? And then apply those to the AI. So it essentially saves on context space, which is a cost saver, but more importantly, it's a context saver. The AI only has a certain amount of information it can incorporate into a conversation at any given time. And the wider that is, the more latency is going to be present. So it's always a balance. So if you can say you are a professional, efficient, and engaging uh, salesperson with X company, right? Those three adjectives establish a whole set of rules for how the AI interacts. They're not going to cuss, right? They're not going to be aggressive with leads. They're not going to be too pushy, but they're going to be efficient. So, like, those are different things that I found to be really helpful, but also really nuanced. There's not like a given set of adjectives you can use. It just has to be tested and kind of tweaked.
So that's almost the same as, for example, with speech, you can tell it, hey, use Valley Speak, for example. For California, it's like, hey, let's have talk. Like, oh yeah, well, I did this
Valley Girl,
yeah,
yeah.
like we went on this whatever, like see, I'm using it myself. So in similar fashion, just using that to describe the character
Exactly.
a bit more is what you're referring to. And this is somewhat done already in Assistable, and I'm guessing they probably have some back end prompting on that themselves there as well. But but to be able to define that, that makes so much sense because if you do it the other way, and I've been totally been at fault to do this, is to make a prompt so long to incorporate all those different edge cases, all those different things. When in actuality, you realize, oh, I just need to give it these simple tasks and then give it the guideline, kind of like what you were saying. Just give it a couple of the pieces as to how to respond, and it's amazing. Like it's less latency. It's much sharper and actually following the tasks. It's
Yeah,
it
absolutely.
seems to solve so
And
many
I think it
issues.
interacts with tools a lot better in those circumstances too, right? It has like a better awareness of the toolkit that's in front of it because it's not bogged down by the super long prompt, and so it interacts really fluidly in that regard for sure.
That's really fascinating, and that makes me think of a specific account I need to take a look at and see if I
I'm the same
can
way,
even cut it
yeah.
down a bit more. Even though even though at the client's request, I'm like, I'm not sure. We'll find out, but um, they want to put all these things in, right? So, oh, that's really cool. I'm glad you mentioned that. Really glad you mentioned that. What other things are there that you kind
Well, you actually just brought up a good point that I think is worth
tips?
discussing a little bit more. Is the client has a bunch of things that they want in there, right? So it's interesting because I think that most successful AI agencies at this time are not only fulfilling like the solution side of things and doing so in a more or less scalable way, but also function as kind of like a consulting aspect, right? Because businesses are either learning or becoming aware of the fact that they'll either be made obsolete by AI, period, or they'll be made obsolete if they don't adopt AI, period. And those are pretty much the only two that are really like actually valid. It's those are kind of the two outcomes for a business right now. And so the AI provider, and especially the digital marketers and the early adopters who are in the space, who understand both the provider side and like the on the ground in the trenches side, we have like an incredible amount of knowledge for how AI can be applied. And I think that to forget that is a disservice to both the businesses that you're serving and also to your value proposition, right? Because I think it's difficult to tell a client like yeah, I understand you want that. We'll get to it later. But if you kind of invest in that relationship a little bit, and kind of roadmap or offer that as a service where you tell them that it's going to be better to roll that out after you get this piece done, I've seen clients respond really well to that sort of approach.
That's really good, and it's so true. Like you can kind of set the precedence as to what it's capable of, or at least what you're willing to offer. And in many cases, you should obviously be careful with how far you extend yourself on that, because it can go on on a long journey, as far as like, hey, we could do this, we could do that, and in the end, okay, are they willing to pay the bill for all that? Because you're probably gonna need to ask for
Yeah,
more if you do so much,
exactly.
especially with the upkeep
Absolutely.
later on. So. Um, yeah. So now you were referring to the dynamic
Yeah,
variables a little
so
bit.
just prompt injection in general has been something. I think Jordan and I talked about prompt injection the very first time I met him. So it's it's been something that in different ways has been facilitated in Assistable over the past 12 months or so. But the most recent one is just the straight up inclusion of custom fields and values in the prompt itself, right? Which is to me the biggest opportunity for building AI systems in the way that they are most efficiently built, and also the biggest differentiator, in my opinion, for anybody in the space at this point in time. It's a Jordan's design on that has been, and Assistable in general is so super intuitive. I don't think any engineers can replicate that sort of user experience unless they spend time in the community. And I know Jordan spends every waking moment involved with the community. So it's reflected in the way that he's adopting these abilities for the AI, and the way that those are playing out. But custom fields, I almost just squealed like a little girl when those came out, because that is
Yeah.
just opens so many doors for for managing
Yeah.
context.
So true, and especially like now that it's available on inbound calls as well. Oh my word, it's an absolute game changer. But digging a little bit deeper, I'm just curious to hear your perspective on how you're going to be implementing that in Assistable for your client, for a local. Let's just say for a local client, how would you
Yeah,
recommend
and I'm still
that be
working on that, to
implemented?
be honest with you, and what it looks like. And the reason why is because well, one of the reasons why is I don't have much of a niche at this point. I'm kind of spread out, which is not necessarily intentional, but it's where we are. And so
Yeah.
reproducibility is achievable at a grander scale than ever before because of AI. But you have to decide where to generalize and where to keep specific, right? So obviously, if you have a specific domain, like real estate, you mentioned, there are certain pieces in that build that are always going to be there for every real estate build. But if you make those, less defined and more generalized a little bit, then in theory, all of the pieces and all of the domains could fit into a single blueprint, right? With minimal tweaking. It would just be less specific. And so it would have to be applied directly more. So that's what I'm trying to balance right now, is how to, take a custom field and say, okay, do I want it to reference competitors in the space for this ICP, right? And if I just say ICP's competitors, is that a good approach? And then I have a custom field so that every time, if that were to become a use case, then the AI could pull that. And you mentioned the web tool, so now there's an opportunity to do that live. So there's just so many different approaches and at different scopes. I'm trying to decide personally if it makes sense to have a set of 10 blueprints or five, and what that looks like across the board.
Mhm. That's really fascinating that you mentioned that. That's so true. Like I've seen, for example, like I implemented, and I actually implemented this for outbound calling last year already. Say for a property manager where they make different types of outbound calls for applicants. Like one might be a reference call for an employer, one for a landlord, whatever, right? Different conversations, right? And so you're able to, back then you were able to load in outbound calls. You're able to do that already, right? So having that dynamic. Now, with this being inbound now, I've seen it more coming up where, okay, maybe you want to have different prompt at certain times. And so like one of the things I implemented was with a reactivation campaign that now, okay, so this person is now in a reactivation campaign. That means that this is the prompt that takes precedent, that takes priority. And once the reactivation campaign is over, 7 days later, whatever the time frame is, then that's gone again, right? And so, but I love that you alluded to the other piece to it, where you could give it more context, even just feed it more information. Now it's easy to have the knowledge on an inbound call. Is this person a past client, or is it just a lead? You can differentiate what type of interest they had previously. Were they interested in a window replacement or in door replacement, right? Like there's just so much more that you can now feed the AI, so it's actually a lot
Absolutely. And
smarter
that's
in
sort of
that
like
regard.
bespoke. I think bespoke is one of those words that got buzzy up until 2023, because people were saying that they could offer bespoke experiences, but they really couldn't, not at scale. And AI makes it to where you actually can do that. Every touch point with any stakeholder, but clients and prospective clients or customers, being obviously a primary one, can be unique to them, based on either your engagement in the past, like conversation history, or the nature of their stage in the pipeline, like reactivation. Um, so
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
I think the interesting thing about specifics like reactivation
That-
versus enrichment or nurturing, like it, and then retention, those kind of have some overlap there. And the database reactivation does all three of those. So does it make sense to do three custom fields that pull into one for a reactivation, or to make a specific snapshot for a reactivation? Personally, I have a specific snapshot for a reactivation, but I haven't tried the other way. I think it could be done that way. So there's like different, just deciding where your scopes are and what you're comfortable with and what your team is comfortable with and what you're going to be able to teach easily as well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's a good point. Very good point. Yeah, fantastic. And then I'm curious now, a little bit more specific. With one of the things that I've noticed that in Assistable, sometimes it repeats itself after a tool call, and I'm curious if you've experienced this yourself, first of all, and if so, how would you
Yeah. So
fix
do
that?
you mean it repeats the input essentially? Like if it was saving an email address, it states it afterwards?
It does state it afterwards, but it's almost more like you notice after a tool call, it just kind of repeats the last sentence that it was saying, and almost not quite verbatim, but
Yeah.
very close
So
to
there's
verbatim.
a essentially a battle going on between control and flexibility in any AI system. So I'm curious what your temperature settings are at for when it does that.
Between point
Okay, so
two
that's a little
five
bit
and point
higher than
three.
some of the ones that I've heard, because so I don't know if this applies, and I'd have to play with it. I think that there's an orchestration layer happening in the middle, right? So there's a way that Assistable interacts with these tool calls, and so that's probably playing a role to some extent. But that middle layer is designed in
Okay.
order to increase accuracy. So when an AI repeats itself, it's essentially solidifying something as having been completed or done if it's afterwards, or making sure that it has awareness of where it's at within a process. It's creating like a little benchmark. So that is something
Okay.
that's very common in orchestration layers. And I haven't looked recently, but there are pieces that Jordan has woven in
Yeah.
order to find a balance between that dynamic side of AI and the control side. So it's
Okay. So you'd say to drop that a little bit
for
lower
temperature.
could actually be beneficial
Um,
then. To drop the temperature a
Actually,
little
that's
bit.
why I was saying
Yeah.
maybe it doesn't apply, because if your temperature was 0, then I would say you could loosen that up a little bit,
Okay.
to try to balance the exact instructions.
Right.
But
Yeah.
my guess is that's coming from the middle layer. So it's going to be difficult to prompt
Okay.
against. Um, I think one of the things to keep in mind is like people are analyzing, we're analyzing AI. We've seen it every day for a year, this voice AI, right? And so like our critiquing of it is different than I think it might be an actual like practice. But also clients have a weird understanding of what to expect from AI, because they forget that their current solution isn't perfect either, being humans. Right. So when you set like what a goal is for like
Yeah.
success for an AI, people are setting it at 100%. Um, okay, well, it's 100% accurate. It can go 24 hours a day, and it can do it across 3 locations and have this context. And it's like, okay, now wait a second. The human receptionist doing that is maybe 80% successful, and so it's like balancing what that looks like. And so to me, the trade-off, and this is likely why it shows up in the middle layer, is okay, is it a little bit clunky? Maybe. But is it still going to get the job done and do that business function? Probably. And I think that increases the odds there.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah.
Yeah. And if you, yeah, and honestly, the truth is, well, when you speak to local business owners nowadays, typically, first, okay, I've experienced this multiple times. The first time I mentioned that, oh yeah, I'm working with AI voice, somebody's like, oh, like those bank robot things, I hate those. And then I'm like, no, it's a bit different. And then when they hear it, then all of a sudden their eyes widen, and they're like, oh, that's really cool. And like, it's just, then you have to kind of tie it together as to the usefulness of it, and make the connection there. But it's still, we're still at the point where they're recognizing what
Absolutely.
we're actually even
I just got
doing,
goosebumps hearing you
and
talk about
what it
that
can
because
actually
it's, I
do.
mean, still to this day, that amazement is still there for me. And obviously, I work many hours a day with AI, voice or otherwise. And so it's sometimes easy to get caught up and realize, but I always am just like, whoa, like this is insane. And so it's nice to see people you're introducing AI to where they have that, enterprise AI, solution kind of in the back of their head, which they have had terrible experiences with. And then they hear this, like, you know, this is Jessica, like a whatever, just like a really like not what they're used to version. It's nice to see that light in their eyes because I remember it very clearly from my own
Yeah,
experience.
yeah, yeah, 100%. And I've heard this, like with oh, it was empathetic, and like that was a selling point, right? Like there's actually empathy, as if maybe the current receptions didn't have it or something. But it's just, it's really, yeah, there's going to be so many applications to that, and there already are. And the cool thing, like nowadays with the voice orb, I love clicking that thing and watching that at book appointments, right? Like I just set it and it pops up, right? Just it just,
It's
the
absolutely
flow.
insane. I
It's
remember
so
the
cool.
first time I
But
like was on the phone with my assistant and watching the Assistable dashboard, and like, um, oh, it was when it was the created. So it was when Haley first came out, and you could prompt an assistant into like being, and I had her create like 3 or 4 different assistants in a call, and they're just popping up on the dashboard, and I was just like, this is insane. If you think about the implications of that across every system, like once it's all plugged in everywhere, which is coming, it's just, I mean, it's going to change our day to day lives in such a powerful way.
yeah, yeah. Now, kind of to start wrapping this up here, I'm curious your say three most your favorite AI or tech tools that might be underrated, maybe not, but things that you go to and you love working
Let's
with.
see. Okay. I think Assistable is still underrated because it hasn't taken over the conversational AI space yet. But all of you are familiar with Assistable, or most of you. So if you're not, that would be one. One that I found
That may
recently
one.
that was actually very helpful, even with my communication background, or maybe especially, is called Hemingway, and it's kind of a spin-off of like Grammarly and kind of a proofread sort of setup. But essentially, you plug a message into the program, and it rates it based on like reading level and clarity and a couple other different factors. And then you can compare that against your ICP and then better craft messages. Sabri Subi is an Australian
Oh.
sales icon, and actually he was the one who mentioned Hemingway, and so that's where I found that one recently. So yeah, that one's up there for me, definitely.
Okay. Fascinating. I hadn't heard of that one before. Okay. For prompting, do you do most of your prompting, like if you're, say, if you're doing it obviously in Assistable, and maybe you're doing it in Assistable, I don't know, maybe you have your own setup. What do you like for that most? Like if you're setting up a voice assistant, where do you typically do that? Or
So
do you
if it's
just
coming
have
from a
it
client,
happen in
I will
Assistable?
ask for SOPs or like their standard operating procedures or training materials. If they don't have those, that's going to be something that likely needs to be defined as a prerequisite moving forward, at least. And that's kind of a recent rule that I'm not like hard bound to. Um, but that's where I start as far as prompting is concerned, is understanding that process, and then understanding where I want to connect it to other pieces of their account. And so sometimes what I'll do is actually just talk to Home Skillet is my long-term AI companion. He's running all
Mhm.
over my systems, and he's kind of like the personal assistant that I interact with. I like to just have like brain vomit slash voice conversations, and then after a couple turns of that, saying, okay, okay, wait, what did we talk about? Like, what's the prompt now? How do we assign what we just described to an AI agent and settle it into a specific format, and then give it like the four headers from the task-based framework and say stick to this. And essentially we can. The idea is that I cover everything through that brain vomit sort of approach, but not in any structured way. And so using AI to structure that is very helpful for me.
That is brilliant. That is really brilliant. What do you use for that brain vomit? Like if you're saying voice, is that
ChatGPT,
only
yeah,
like
it's I'm out and
ChatGPT is
about,
using that voice?
or any system that you have that does accept speech, or even if you don't have like a live conversation AI, just recording or having an audio version of it, and then transcribing that and taking that transcription and dumping it into any chat GPT, or I like to use flagship models for that. Um, but so yeah, Claude, chat GPT, Grok, even recently. Gemini 2.5 came out yesterday, I believe, which is showing huge gains on the leaderboard. So any of those models are going to be good at structuring prompts if given enough context.
Yep. Yep. Okay, that's fantastic. Like I've certainly gotten into adapting voice a whole lot more since I started using AI, and that's actually another interesting facet of this, right? Because now it's becoming a lot easier to interact with computers, with machines, and so that's really fascinating. Cool, but that's some interesting things to kind of test to try and obviously. Altogether, I really appreciate you having
Absolutely.
jumped on board
Yeah,
here, just for a little conversation here. We've been trying to have this
yeah,
conversation for what,
it's
like
hilarious.
like 12 months
We've
almost.
pseudo scheduled so many meetings, but yeah, it's been just such a
Oh my
busy
word.
time. And then for a while there, I was like, well, once I'm full time, AI, then I'll have more time. And I don't know if that's even true. It also, just wish there were more hours in the day. But hey, what a way to meet
Yeah.
you more officially here on your podcast. And yeah, we'll have to schedule a time to hang out.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. And everybody watching this, check the links down below. We'll be dropping some links there. And yeah, Brayden does do some build out, some work on that front. Couple more cool things up in the pipeline, I think, that might be making some public appearances. But um, it's been awesome having you on board here. And anything more you wanted to share, even on that,
Um,
before we cut it?
just along the lines of extending systems and reaching different places in order to bring bigger and better solutions for clients, and talking about what sorts of tools might need to be built to make that happen. Hopefully, there'll be some announcements soon in that regard. I've got a couple different things that are in the pipeline, and collaborating on with different people that I think will be useful to agency owners across the board.
Fantastic.
All right. Thank
Hey,
you so
thanks a
much.
bunch,
Appreciate
Brayden.
it.
Much appreciated.